In 1945, in a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a discovery was made, an archaeological discovery, of some codices. And within these codices were what are now called Gnostic texts. And this was a huge discovery because it offered some alternative views of what has come to be known as Orthodox Christianity. So since then, a load of scholarship has obviously been done on these texts. Up until this point, what we knew of these Gnostic sects mostly came from people that were arguing against them and would quote their books, like Irenaeus of Lyon, for example. And so it was a huge discovery to be able to have the texts themselves to look at and go off of. But I would say that not only do we see scholarship coming from these texts as a result, but actually they've worked their way into popular culture at large as well. And I'm going to do another video on that further down the line. But what I wanted to look at today is the understanding of creation that these Gnostic texts speak to, specifically one of them, and compare and contrast that, going back to my last video, to the creation account that we have in Genesis. So the book that I'm going to be looking at is often called the apocryphon of John. And this is very interesting language because we have apocryphon of John on one hand, and then we also have another book called the Apocalypse of John on the other hand. And this is what we now call in English the book of Revelation. It's part of the Christian scriptures. And it's interesting because apocalypse means to uncover or unveil, and apocryphon, you can probably tell they come from the same root, but it means the opposite. It means hidden or secret. And so this gets to a fundamental part of Gnostic texts, which is this idea of gnosis. And gnosis is a Greek word for knowledge. Again, hopefully you're seeing the connection to my last video, which was about how knowledge, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was a fundamental part of the first sin in the book of Genesis. But gnosis, in Greek, we have multiple words for knowledge, a bit like how we have the English word love. Well, in Greek, you have agape, you have phileo, you have eros, you have different words to describe what we call love. It's similar with knowledge. You have episteme, which is where we get the modern word epistemology, and then you also have this word gnosis. And Nicola Lewis says that gnosis refers to a special kind of insight into the nature of reality. So to gain not this kind of knowledge, this gnosis, you have to transcend somewhat in order to attain it. You can't just find it by looking around you. You need some sort of special insight into the world. And so what Gnostic texts are trying to do, rather than the apocalypse of St. John, which is Jesus coming to him in a vision and saying, I'm revealing to you. And ultimately, remember, the Apocalypse of John was not just this kind of esoteric thing for John to keep to himself. It's addressed as a letter to 7 churches, to 7 communities of Christ followers that were embodying the way of Jesus in community in the midst of the Roman Empire. This book was uncovering what's really going on behind the scenes of the powers of the world and their way of doing things, but also where that ultimately will lead. And then also, on the other hand, we have the apocryphon of John, which is, John's upset after the crucifixion of Jesus, and Jesus comes to him and says, I'm going to reveal to you this secret hidden knowledge. And then the goal of people that read this book is to attain that knowledge also for themselves. So these are fundamentally different ways of knowing. And I'm hoping that talking about the creation myth that the apocryphon of John speaks about, or it's also called the secret book, is going to highlight what Genesis is saying even clearer for us. So I'm going to quote a length now from David Braque to give us a kind of overview of this Gnostic creation myth. He says, according to the secret book, wisdom is the last of the 24 aeons and thus the most distant, so to speak, of the invisible spirit. So aeons are like these kind of sub-divine beings, spirits, but then there's this ultimate invisible spirit, which is ultimately completely unknowable to us, especially as humans. And so there's this kind of hierarchy that's being laid out. When wisdom, in Greek Sophia, produced a thought of her own, without the consent of her male consort, the result was an imperfect thought or pseudo-aeon. the first divine being that does not belong to the entirety or mortals. Wisdom cast this misshapen product of her thinking outside the entirety and named it Aldebaoth. Aldebaoth, also called Saklas and other names, is the misguided creator and ruler of this material universe. That is the god of Genesis. One more quote a bit further on, he says, the Gnostics then had a range of views about the origin of the material universe and its ruler, but they all agreed that Aldebaoth, the god of this world, is arrogant and ignorant, and his realm is one of darkness and corruption. So Aldebaoth is created, and then ultimately later in the story, human beings are going to come on the scene. And when they eat of the fruit, you have the same fruit, the tree, and all of that. When they eat of it, it's actually a good thing because their eyes are opened, exactly the same as in Genesis. But remember, this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so the human beings attain gnosis when they eat of the fruit. And so that's a good thing because the God that made that world that they are living in is an evil one. And so when they eat of the fruit, they are able to transcend and see beyond into what is called the entirety, where there is good to be found. And so you can see how the goal of knowledge always has to be transcendent and attaining from outside of the material world in which we live, because that's the nature of how you come to know within the Gnostic mythology and cosmology. So let me look at some of the different themes that are coming out here within these two different accounts. So in Genesis, we get that the world was created and it was very good. In the Gnostic, the secret books creation myth, the physical world is not very good. In fact, it's destined for destruction and it's inherently evil. The God of the Bible is benevolent, whereas the Gnostic God of this world, Aldebaoth, is malevolent. Eating of the fruit was not the plan in the book of Genesis. God wanted them to come to know knowledge of good and evil through relationship with him, because he's this benevolent character that longs for relationship with human beings. Whereas it was a good thing in the Gnostic text. Wisdom is the cause of evil in the world, or the cause of the God that, is evil. And knowledge is the escape. So knowledge is seen as above wisdom. Whereas in the Judeo-Christian understanding and in the scriptures, there is a whole genre of wisdom literature, and knowledge is seen to be important and have its place, but be not be superior to wisdom. Books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are designed to be wisdom literature to impart wisdom to people. And so what we can see here being laid out is that the Gnostic creation myth actually flips Genesis completely on its head in many ways. And it causes us to think about how our cosmology, what we believe about this world and the stuff that it's made up of and how we got here, does that influence how we come to see things like how we gain information and understanding of the world, how we gain understanding? Because knowledge doesn't just refer to like a fact or a piece of information, it refers to knowledge of another person. How do we come to interact and to know? Yada is the Hebrew word for knowing, and that knowing isn't just a kind of intellectual way of knowing. It even refers to sexual union with someone, to know someone. It's that embodied in the Hebrew way of understanding. Whereas in this Gnostic way of understanding, the material world is at least sub the spiritual realm, the esoteric realm, but at most it might even be evil. Matter is considered evil. And so I think that this invites us in to ask ourselves, what do we think about these things? And this is laying some seeds today for some discussions of where I think we should take some of this understanding of the Gnostic texts and what has come to be called, you notice how I haven't used the word Gnosticism today, but that is more like the philosophy that we can extract out from some of these Gnostic texts that were discovered in Nag Hammadi, amongst other places. So hopefully that this has served to lay a foundation of compare and contrast between these creation myths, and I will be making other videos on this subject to highlight, okay, what does this mean for us today then?